Emma Thompson had been looking for work for 3 months when the job posting appeared online. It was simple and direct. Night cleaner wanted at Thornwick Castle. Good pay. Must work alone. Must be reliable. She had applied without thinking twice because her savings were running low and her small apartment rent was due next week. The castle stood on a hill outside the town like something from a fairy tale. It had tall towers and thick stone walls that had been there for hundreds of years. When Emma drove through the iron gates for her interview, she felt small next to the massive building. The windows seemed to watch her as she parked her old car in the employee lot. Mrs. Chen was the head housekeeper. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. She walked Emma through the main halls during the day shift when other workers were busy cleaning and maintaining the castle. The place was huge with endless corridors and rooms filled with expensive furniture and old paintings. Your shift starts at 10 p.m. and ends at 6 a.m., Mrs. Chen explained as they walked past a room full of ancient armor. You will work completely alone. The family sleeps in the West Wing, and the day staff goes home at 9. You must clean the main halls, the library, the dining rooms, and the guest chambers. You must dust all the furniture and polish the floors. Emma nodded and tried to remember everything. The pay was better than anything she had found in months. She could finally catch up on her bills and maybe even save some money. But then Mrs. Chen stopped walking and turned to face Emma with a serious expression. There are rules you must follow, she said. Her voice became quieter and more intense. Stay away from the East Garden after 11 p.m. Do not go there for any reason. Also, you must never touch anything that does not belong to your cleaning duties. Some things in this castle are very old and very valuable. Emma felt a chill run down her back. Why can't I go to the East Garden, she asked. Mrs. Chen looked around as if making sure no one was listening. There are things in that garden that are better left alone, she whispered. Old things. Things that have been there for a very long time. Just stay away and you will be fine. Emma wanted to ask more questions, but Mrs. Chen had already started walking again. The older woman showed her where the cleaning supplies were kept and explained which rooms needed daily attention. Emma signed her employment papers and was told to start the next night. When Emma arrived for her first shift at 10 p.m., the castle felt completely different. During the day, it had been busy with workers and filled with natural light from the tall windows. Now it was dark and quiet. Her footsteps echoed in the empty halls as she pushed her cleaning cart from room to room. The silence was thick and heavy. Every small sound seemed louder than it should be. The old wooden floors creaked under her feet. The wind outside made strange noises as it moved through the towers. Sometimes Emma thought she heard other sounds, but when she stopped to listen, there was nothing there. As she cleaned the library, she kept thinking about Mrs. Chen warning about the East Garden. What could be so dangerous about a garden that she was not allowed to go there? Why had the older woman seemed so scared when she talked about it? Emma tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept wandering to the mysterious garden. By midnight, she had finished cleaning 3 large rooms and was taking a short break. She sat in one of the comfortable chairs in the library and looked out the tall window. She could see part of the gardens in the moonlight. They looked peaceful and beautiful, but also somehow mysterious. Emma decided that Mrs. Chen was probably just trying to scare the new employee. Old people always had strange superstitions about old places. There was probably nothing wrong with the East Garden, except that it might have expensive plants that could be damaged. But as she returned to her cleaning, she could not shake the feeling that something was watching her from the dark corners of the castle. 2 weeks had passed since Emma started working at Thornwick Castle. She had grown used to the empty halls and strange sounds that came with working alone at night. The job was not difficult, and the pay was helping her catch up on all her bills. But every night she found herself thinking more and more about the East Garden that Mrs. Chen had warned her to avoid. During her break on the 15th night, Emma decided she could not resist her curiosity any longer. She had finished cleaning the main dining hall early and had 30 minutes before she needed to start on the guest rooms. The castle was quiet as always, and no one would know if she took a quick look at the Forbidden Garden. Emma left her cleaning cart in the hallway and walked toward the east wing of the castle. She had never been to this part of the building before. The corridors here seemed older and the air felt colder. The moonlight coming through the windows created long shadows on the stone floors. Her footsteps seemed louder than usual as she made her way to the door that led outside. The east garden was much larger than she had expected. It stretched out in front of her like a maze of perfectly cut hedges and winding stone paths. Ancient oak trees stood like silent guards around the edges of the garden. Everything was bathed in silver moonlight that made the whole place look magical and mysterious. Emma walked slowly along the main path, taking in the beauty of the carefully maintained flower beds and ornate stone benches. The garden was clearly very old, but someone was taking excellent care of it. Every hedge was perfectly shaped and every flower bed was free of weeds. The silence here was different from the silence inside the castle. It felt alive somehow, as if the garden itself was breathing. At the center of the garden, Emma discovered something that made her stop and stare in amazement. There stood the most beautiful statue she had ever seen. It was a life-sized figure of a man dressed in the uniform of a royal guard. He wore a formal military jacket with brass buttons, and a ceremonial sword hung at his side. A cap sat perfectly on his head at just the right angle. But it was the face of the statue that truly captured Emma's attention. The stone had been carved with incredible skill and detail. She could see every feature clearly in the moonlight. He had strong cheekbones and a firm jaw. His lips were perfectly shaped and seemed almost real. His eyes looked straight ahead with an expression that was both serious and kind. Emma walked around the statue, examining it from every angle. The craftsmanship was amazing. She could see individual buttons on his uniform, and even the texture of his hair beneath his cap. Someone had spent a lot of time and effort creating this masterpiece. She wondered who the statue was meant to represent and why it was placed here in this hidden garden. The longer Emma looked at the statue, the more she felt drawn to it. There was something about the face that seemed familiar, even though she was sure she had never seen it before. The expression was so lifelike that she almost expected him to turn his head and look at her. Emma realized she had been standing there for almost 20 minutes. She needed to get back to work before someone noticed she was missing. But as she turned to leave, she felt a strange reluctance to go. The statue seemed to be watching her, even though she knew that was impossible. She promised herself she would come back tomorrow night to see the beautiful statue again. Something about it called to her in a way she could not explain. Emma could not stop thinking about the statue in the East Garden. During the day, when she tried to sleep, she would see the handsome stone face in her dreams. At work, she found herself rushing through her cleaning duties so she could spend more time in the garden during her breaks. Every night for the past week, Emma had visited the statue. She had started bringing her coffee and sitting on the stone bench facing him while she took her break. At first, she just sat quietly and admired the beautiful craftsmanship. But soon she began talking to the statue as if he were a real person who could hear her. "I had such a difficult day today," she would say while sipping her coffee. "My landlord called about the rent again, and my car is making strange noises. I hope it does not break down because I cannot afford to fix it right now." The statue never answered, of course, but Emma felt better after sharing her problems with him. His stone face seemed kind and understanding. She began to imagine what his voice might sound like if he could speak. Probably deep and gentle, she thought. He looked like someone who would be a good listener. Emma started paying more attention to how she looked before coming to work. She began wearing makeup and her nicest clothes, even though she was just going to be cleaning all night. She told herself it was silly, but she wanted to look good when she visited the statue. She even started wearing perfume, which seemed crazy since he was made of stone and could not smell anything. Her friend Sarah, who worked the day shift, began noticing changes in Emma's behavior. "You seem different lately," Sarah said one afternoon when they passed each other during the shift change. "You look tired but also happy, like you have some kind of secret. Are you seeing someone new?" Emma just smiled and shook her head. She could not possibly explain to Sarah that she was falling in love with the statue. Even she knew how insane that sounded. But every night when she looked into those perfectly carved stone eyes, she felt something real and powerful. Something that made her heart beat faster in a way no living man had ever managed to do. The other castle staff started whispering about Emma's strange behavior. They noticed she seemed distracted during training meetings and always looked eager to get to work. Some of them joked that the night shift was making her go crazy from being alone too much. Mrs. Chen watched Emma carefully but never said anything about her visits to the East Garden. Emma began bringing small gifts for the statue. She would pick flowers from other parts of the garden and place them at his feet. Sometimes she brought cookies from her lunch and left them on the bench beside him. She even brought a small photograph of herself and tucked it behind one of the stone buttons on his uniform. "I know you cannot eat these," she would say as she arranged the flowers around the base of the statue. "But I wanted to bring you something nice. You are my only friend here, and you make me feel less lonely." Every morning when Emma came back to check, the flowers and cookies were always gone. She told herself that birds or small animals must have taken them during the day. But part of her wanted to believe that somehow the statue appreciated her gifts. The strangest thing was how real the statue seemed to her now. In the moonlight, his skin looked warm and alive. His uniform appeared to move slightly in the night breeze. Sometimes Emma thought she saw his chest rise and fall as if he were breathing, but she knew that was just her imagination playing tricks on her. Emma began staying longer and longer in the garden each night. She would tell the statue about her childhood and her dreams for the future. She shared secrets she had never told anyone else. The stone guard became her confidant and her closest companion, even though he never said a word in return. Other people might think she was losing her mind, but Emma had never felt happier or more connected to another being in her entire life. October had arrived and the nights were getting colder. Emma had been working at the castle for 6 weeks now, and her visits to the statue had become the most important part of each day. She looked forward to her time in the garden more than anything else in her life. On a particularly cold Thursday night, Emma was sitting on her usual bench, telling the statue about her plans for the weekend. The air was so cold she could see her breath forming little clouds in front of her face. She had brought hot coffee to keep warm and was holding the mug close to her chest. "I might visit my sister this weekend," she said, looking up at the handsome stone face. "She keeps asking why I seem so happy lately. I wish I could tell her about you, but she would think I had lost my mind." As Emma spoke, she noticed something strange. Small droplets of water had formed around the area where the statue mouth was carved. At first, she thought it might be dew forming on the cold stone, but the droplets looked exactly like the breath clouds she was making when she spoke in the cold air. Emma stood up from the bench and moved closer to examine the statue face. Her heart began beating faster as she realized what she was seeing. The moisture around the statue mouth looked exactly like condensation from breathing. But that was impossible. Statues did not breathe. She rubbed her eyes and looked again. The tiny water droplets were definitely there. They formed a small pattern around his lips, just like breath would create on a cold night. Emma felt dizzy as she tried to understand what she was seeing. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on the statue cheek. She expected to feel cold stone like every other time she had touched the statue. Instead, her fingers felt warmth. Real human warmth, as if blood were flowing beneath the skin. The warmth lasted only a few seconds before the stone became cold again, but Emma was sure of what she had felt. Emma stepped back from the statue with her hand shaking. She looked around the empty garden, wondering if someone was playing a trick on her, but there was no one else there. She was completely alone with the statue, just like every other night. For the rest of her shift, Emma could not concentrate on her cleaning duties. Her mind kept returning to the moment when she had felt warmth in the stone face. She kept touching her own cheek to compare the feeling. There was no doubt that for just a moment the statue had felt like living human skin. When Emma got home that morning, she could not sleep. She lay in bed replaying the strange experience over and over in her mind. She tried to convince herself that she had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the cold night air had confused her senses, Maybe she was spending too much time alone, and her mind was starting to play tricks on her. But Emma knew what she had felt. The warmth had been real and unmistakable. Something impossible was happening in that garden, and she needed to understand what it was. Emma spent her day off at the local library researching the history of Thornwick Castle. She searched through old newspapers and historical records looking for any information about the East Garden or statues on the castle grounds. What she found made her heart race with excitement and fear. In a newspaper from October 1924, she discovered an article about a missing person. A young royal guard named Alexander Morrison had disappeared from the castle grounds exactly 100 years ago. His body was never found, and the case was never solved. The newspaper included a photograph of Alexander in his uniform. Emma stared at the picture in shock. The face looking back at her from the old newspaper was identical to the statue in the garden. Every feature was exactly the same. The strong cheekbones, the kind eyes, the perfectly shaped lips. Emma realized that the statue was not just a work of art. It was a memorial to a real person who had vanished mysteriously from the very place where she now worked. But if Alexander had disappeared a century ago, how could his statue feel warm and seem to breathe? That night, Emma returned to the garden with new purpose. She needed to learn more about Alexander Morrison and discover the truth about what had happened to him. Emma became obsessed with learning everything she could about Alexander Morrison. She spent every free moment at the library and local museum searching through historical records and old documents. The more she discovered about the missing guard, the more fascinated and frightened she became. Alexander had been 25 years old when he disappeared. Emma realized with a shock that she was exactly the same age now. He had worked at Thornwick Castle for 3 years and was known by everyone as kind and dedicated. The other servants loved him because he was always willing to help with extra work and never complained about difficult assignments. According to the old employment records, Alexander often volunteered for night shifts in the gardens. He believed that extra security was important to protect the royal family while they slept. The head groundskeeper had written that Alexander took special pride in maintaining the East Garden and could often be found there during his breaks. Emma found several letters written by other castle employees who had worked with Alexander. They all described him as handsome and well-mannered. One letter mentioned that several of the young maids had romantic feelings for Alexander, but he was always respectful and professional with everyone. The most interesting discovery came from a diary that had been donated to the local museum by the family of a former castle employee. The diary belonged to a maid named Margaret who had worked at the castle in 1924. Emma's heart pounded as she read Margaret's entries about Alexander. "I cannot stop thinking about the handsome guard who works in the East Garden," Margaret had written. "Alexander has the kindest eyes I have ever seen, and when he smiles at me, my heart feels like it might burst. I know we can never be together because of our different positions, but I dream about him every night." Margaret's diary entries became more and more emotional as the weeks went by. She wrote about watching Alexander from her window as he patrolled the gardens at night. She described leaving small gifts for him, flowers and cookies, that she would place on the garden benches hoping he would find them. Emma felt chills reading these entries because they sounded exactly like her own feelings and actions. Margaret had done the same things Emma was doing now. She had fallen in love with Alexander just as Emma had fallen in love with his statue. The final entries in Margaret's diary were the most disturbing. She wrote about strange dreams where Alexander would visit her at night. In these dreams, he seemed as real as any living person. They would talk and laugh together, and sometimes he would hold her hand or touch her face. Margaret wrote that these dreams felt more real than her waking life. But then Alexander disappeared, and Margaret's final diary entry was heartbreaking. She wrote that she felt responsible for his disappearance. She believed that her feelings for him had somehow caused something terrible to happen. The entry ended with Margaret's decision to leave the castle and never return. Emma also found police reports from the investigation into Alexander's disappearance. The authorities had searched everywhere, but found no trace of him. Some witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the East Garden on the night he vanished. Others claimed they heard voices coming from the garden, even though no one was supposed to be there. One police report mentioned that several people in the town believed Alexander had been cursed or taken by supernatural forces. The detective in charge had dismissed these claims as superstitious nonsense, but Emma noticed that the investigation had been closed very quickly without any real answers. The local newspaper from that time period included interviews with townspeople about the disappearance. An elderly woman claimed that her grandmother had told stories about the East Garden being haunted by the spirits of people who had died tragic deaths. Another person mentioned that strange things had happened in that garden for generations, but most people were too afraid to talk about them. Emma realized that she might not be the first person to experience supernatural events in the East Garden. The evidence suggested that something had been happening there for a very long time. Alexander's disappearance might have been connected to whatever mysterious force existed in that place. As Emma walked back to the castle that night, she felt both excited and terrified about what she had learned. She was no longer just curious about the statue. She was determined to solve the mystery of what had happened to Alexander Morrison and discover the truth about the strange experiences she was having in the garden. Armed with knowledge about Alexander history, Emma began talking to the statue in a completely different way. Instead of just sharing her daily problems, she spoke to him as if he were the real Alexander Morrison, who had once lived and worked in this same garden. "Alexander," she would say as she sat on the bench facing him, "I learned about what happened to you. I know you were a guard here 100 years ago. I know you were kind and good, and that people loved you. I also know that something terrible happened to make you disappear." The strange phenomena that had started with feeling warmth in the stone began happening more frequently. Emma would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision when she was talking to the statue. Sometimes she thought she heard whispered responses to her questions, although she could never quite make out the words. One night, Emma brought a thermos of hot tea and sat longer than usual in the garden. As she spoke about her research into Alexander's past, she noticed that the statue seemed more lifelike than ever before. In the moonlight, his skin appeared to have a slight glow, and his uniform looked less like stone and more like real fabric. "I found Margaret Diary," she told the statue. "She was in love with you just like I am now. She used to bring you gifts and leave them in this garden hoping you would find them. She dreamed about you every night and felt like you were real even though you were probably already gone by then." As Emma spoke these words, she saw something that made her gasp. For just a moment, the statue eyes seemed to focus directly on her face. The expression changed from the blank stare of stone to something warmer and more human. Emma blinked, and the moment passed, but she was certain of what she had seen. The other castle staff began avoiding Emma during shift changes. They whispered that working alone at night was making her strange and unstable. Mrs. Chen watched Emma carefully but never mentioned the East Garden. Sometimes Emma caught the older woman looking at her with an expression that seemed more worried than angry. Sarah tried to talk to Emma about her behavior. "You look tired all the time," she said, "and you seem distracted like your mind is somewhere else. Are you feeling okay? Maybe you should see a doctor or take some time off work." Emma wanted to tell Sarah about Alexander and the amazing things that were happening in the garden, but she knew her friend would think she had lost her mind. How could she explain that she was falling deeper in love with someone who had been dead for a century, someone who might still exist in some impossible way as a statue that was slowly coming to life? Emma began leaving different kinds of gifts for Alexander. She brought books of poetry and read them aloud to him. She brought her portable radio and played classical music that she thought he might have enjoyed when he was alive. She even brought a small mirror so he could see his own face if he was somehow aware inside the stone. Every morning the gifts would be gone just like always. Emma told herself that maintenance workers probably cleaned up the garden during the day, but she preferred to believe that Alexander was somehow able to appreciate what she brought for him. The most incredible experience happened on a night when Emma had stayed in the garden until almost dawn. She was talking to Alexander about her loneliness and how much their time together meant to her. As she spoke, she felt a gentle breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. The breeze carried a scent that reminded her of old-fashioned cologne, the kind that men might have worn in the 1920s. The breeze seemed to circle around Emma, as if invisible arms were embracing her. She felt warmth and comfort that made her feel less alone than she had ever felt in her life. For several minutes she sat perfectly still, enjoying the sensation of being held by something she could not see but could definitely feel. When the breeze finally stopped, Emma looked up at Alexander's statue and whispered, "I love you. I know that sounds crazy because you are made of stone and you lived 100 years ago. But I love you more than I have ever loved anyone." The statue did not respond, but Emma felt in her heart that somehow her words had been heard and understood. She was no longer just visiting a beautiful work of art. She was spending time with someone who had once been alive and who might in some mysterious way still exist. Halloween night arrived with thick fog that rolled across the castle grounds like a living thing. Emma had been working at Thornwick Castle for exactly 2 months, and her relationship with Alexander's statue had become the center of her entire world. She had spent the day reading more about the date of his disappearance and realized that tonight marked exactly 100 years since Alexander Morrison had vanished from the East Garden. Emma felt that something important was going to happen tonight. The air itself seemed charged with energy and possibility. As she went through her cleaning duties, she found it impossible to concentrate on anything except getting to the garden to see Alexander. Her hands shook with nervous excitement as she pushed her cart through the empty halls. The fog was so thick when Emma stepped outside that she could barely see the path to the garden. But she knew the way by heart now and walked confidently through the swirling mist. The familiar stone benches and carefully trimmed hedges appeared and disappeared in the fog like objects in a dream. Alexander's statue stood in the center of the garden exactly as it always did. But tonight something was different. The fog seemed to avoid the statue, creating a clear circle around him. The moonlight broke through the clouds at that exact moment and illuminated his form with an ethereal glow that made him look more alive than Emma had ever seen him. Emma approached the statue slowly, feeling her heart beating so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Tonight was the anniversary of Alexander's disappearance. If there was ever going to be a moment when something magical could happen, it would be now. "Alexander," she whispered as she stood directly in front of the statue, "I know you can hear me. I know you are more than just stone and metal. I have felt your warmth and seen you move. I have heard your whispers in the wind. Tonight is the night you disappeared 100 years ago. Tonight I want to try something that might seem crazy." Emma had been thinking about this moment for weeks. She had read enough fairy tales and love stories to know that sometimes impossible things became possible through the power of true love. If Alexander was somehow trapped between life and death, maybe her love could set him free. Standing on her tiptoes, Emma placed her hands gently on either side of the statue face. The stone felt warm beneath her palms, just as it had that first night when she had noticed the mysterious changes. She looked directly into his carved eyes and saw something there that convinced her she was doing the right thing. "I love you, Alexander Morrison," she said clearly and firmly. "I love you more than life itself. I love you enough to risk looking foolish. I love you enough to believe in magic." Emma closed her eyes and pressed her lips gently against the stone lips of the statue. She had imagined this moment so many times, but the reality was more intense than any dream. The stone lips were soft and warm beneath hers. They felt exactly like human skin, and for a moment Emma could have sworn they moved in response to her kiss. She poured all of her loneliness, love, and hope into that single kiss. Every night of sitting alone in the garden talking to stone. Every moment of feeling like no one understood her strange connection to this mysterious figure. Every dream she had ever had about finding true love. All of it went into the kiss that she gave to Alexander on the 100th anniversary of his disappearance. When Emma finally pulled back from the statue, she was breathless and shaking. The fog had grown even thicker around them until she could see nothing beyond the small circle where Alexander stood. The silence was complete and absolute, as if the entire world was holding its breath waiting for something momentous to happen. Emma stepped back and looked up at Alexander's face. For a moment, nothing seemed different, and she wondered if she had just made a terrible mistake. Maybe she really was losing her mind. Maybe she was just a lonely woman who had fallen in love with a piece of stone. But then the clock tower of the castle began to chime midnight. 12 deep resonant notes that echoed across the fog-covered garden. As the final chime faded into silence, Emma saw something that would change her life forever. The statue chest began to rise and fall with slow, steady breaths. Emma stood frozen in the fog, watching as the impossible happened before her eyes. The statue of Alexander Morrison was breathing. His chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm that no piece of stone could ever achieve. But that was only the beginning of the miracle that was unfolding in the East Garden. Color began to spread across the statue like sunrise breaking over marble. The gray stone of his face warmed to the pink and tan tones of living human skin. His lips changed from cold marble to soft flesh. His hair shifted from carved stone to real brown locks that moved slightly in the night breeze. Emma wanted to run, but her feet would not move. She wanted to scream, but no sound would come from her throat. She could only stand there and watch as 100 years of enchantment began to reverse itself in front of her amazed eyes. The transformation continued down Alexander's body. His uniform changed from stone to real fabric. The brass buttons became actual metal that gleamed in the moonlight. His ceremonial sword shifted from carved stone to polished steel. Even his boots became real leather that creaked softly as his body prepared to move for the first time in a century. Alexander's eyes were the last thing to change. Emma watched as the blank stone gaze melted away and was replaced by warm brown irises that looked directly at her with recognition and intelligence. When their eyes met, Emma felt a jolt of connection that was more powerful than anything she had ever experienced. Alexander blinked slowly as if he was waking up from the longest sleep in history. He moved his head carefully from side to side, testing muscles that had not been used for 100 years. Then he looked down at his own body as if he could not believe what was happening to him. "Emma," he said, and his voice was exactly as she had imagined it would be, deep and gentle, and filled with gratitude and wonder. His first word in a century was her name. "You brought me back," Alexander continued as he slowly lifted his arms and flexed his fingers. "After all these years trapped in stone, unable to move or speak, but aware of everything around me. You were the one who saw me as more than just a statue. You were the one who loved me enough to break the curse." Emma finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "How is this possible? You were stone. You have been stone for 100 years. People do not just come back to life." Alexander stepped down from the pedestal where he had stood motionless for so long. His movements were slow and careful, but completely human. He reached out and gently touched Emma's face with fingers that were now warm and completely alive. "I was cursed by someone who was jealous of my position and my happiness," Alexander explained. "A man who practiced dark magic and wanted to see me suffer. He trapped me between life and death. I could see and hear everything, but I could not move or speak or touch anything. I watched the world change around me for 100 years. Emma felt tears running down her cheeks as she realized the horror of what Alexander had endured. To be aware and conscious, but completely helpless for an entire century. To watch people come and go while being unable to communicate with anyone. "But you came to me every night," Alexander continued. "You talked to me and brought me gifts. You saw past the stone to the man underneath. Your love was stronger than the curse that held me. When you kissed me tonight on the anniversary of my disappearance, your love finally set me free." Alexander pulled Emma into his arms and held her close. She could feel his heart beating against her chest and smell the scent of his skin. He was completely real and completely alive. The man she had fallen in love with while he was trapped in stone was now flesh and blood in her arms. "I love you too," Emma, Alexander whispered into her hair. "I heard every word you spoke to me during those long nights. I felt your presence and your kindness. You became my reason to hope that someday I might be free. You saved me from an eternity of loneliness." Emma looked up into Alexander's face and saw tears in his eyes. They were both crying now from joy and relief, and the overwhelming power of a love that had conquered death itself. In the fog-covered garden, where Alexander had been trapped for 100 years, they held each other and knew that their lives would never be the same. The reunion between Emma and Alexander was tender and overwhelming. They sat together on the stone bench where Emma had spent so many nights talking to his statue. Alexander held her hands in his as he told her about his century of imprisonment and how her love had given him hope during the darkest moments. "I could hear everything," Alexander explained. "I heard you tell me about your life and your dreams. I heard you say that you loved me even though you thought I was just stone. Your voice was the only light in my darkness all those years." Emma listened in amazement as Alexander described what it had been like to be conscious, but unable to move or respond. He had watched the seasons change around him. He had seen other people come and go from the garden. He had witnessed the castle change and modernize while he remained frozen in time. "But when you started visiting me, everything changed," Alexander said. "For the first time in 100 years, I felt hope. I could feel your presence even when you were not speaking. Your love began to weaken the curse little by little until tonight when your kiss finally broke it completely." Emma asked Alexander about the person who had cursed him. Alexander's face grew sad as he remembered the events that had led to his transformation. A man named Victor Blackwood had worked as an advisor to the royal family. Victor had been jealous of Alexander's position and popularity among the castle staff. "Victor practiced forbidden magic in secret," Alexander explained. "When he discovered that I had learned about his dark activities, he decided to punish me in the cruelest way possible. He cast a spell that would trap me between life and death, as a warning to anyone else who might oppose him." Alexander told Emma that Victor had disappeared shortly after casting the curse. No one ever knew what had happened to him, but Alexander suspected that Victor's own dark magic had eventually destroyed him. Justice had been served, but Alexander had remained trapped for a full century. Now they faced the challenge of explaining Alexander's sudden appearance to the modern world. Emma quit her job at the castle without giving any detailed reasons. She simply told Mrs. Chen that she had found other opportunities and would not be returning. Mrs. Chen looked at Emma with knowing eyes, but asked no questions. Alexander found work as a historical consultant for the castle. His knowledge of life in the 1920s and his understanding of the building history made him valuable to the tourism department. People assumed he was simply a very dedicated researcher who had studied the castle extensively. Emma and Alexander moved into a small house together in the town near the castle. Alexander had to learn about many things that had changed during his century of absence. Cars and computers and cell phones were all mysteries to him at first. But he was intelligent and adaptable, and Emma helped him understand the modern world. The townspeople accepted their love story, though most assumed it was just a romantic tale that Emma had created to explain her relationship with the mysterious historian. Only a few elderly residents remembered the old stories about the cursed garden and wondered if there might be truth behind the legend. 6 months after Alexander awakening, Emma and Alexander were married in the East Garden, where they had first met. It was a small ceremony attended by a few friends and Emma family. Alexander looked handsome in a modern suit, but Emma could still see the noble bearing of the royal guard he had once been. During the wedding ceremony, Emma looked around at the other statues in the garden. Alexander had assured her that they were just ordinary works of art, with no trapped souls inside them. But sometimes on quiet evenings, Emma would catch Alexander staring thoughtfully at the garden, and she wondered if he sensed something she could not. Emma and Alexander settled into a peaceful life together. Alexander learned to drive a car and use a computer. Emma helped him get official identification documents and explained modern customs and technology. In return, Alexander shared stories of life in the 1920s and taught Emma about history and classical literature. Their love story became local legend in the small town. Tour guides at the castle would tell visitors about the night cleaner who fell in love with a statue and the miracle that brought her beloved back to life. Most people smiled and assumed it was just a charming fairy tale. But Emma and Alexander knew the truth. True love had conquered death and time itself. They had been given a second chance that most people only dreamed about. Every morning when Emma woke up beside Alexander, she remembered how close she had come to spending her whole life alone. She never took for granted the miracle that had brought them together. Sometimes Emma would find Alexander standing in their garden at night, looking up at the stars. When she asked what he was thinking about, he would smile and pull her close. "I am thinking about how lucky we are," he would say. Not everyone gets the chance to find their true love. And very few people get to come back from the dead to be with the person they love most. Emma and Alexander had found something more precious than gold or jewels. They had found a love that was stronger than magic and more enduring than stone.